me, "You're my favorite dean ever." I mean that to the bottom of my heart. I'm loyal to the law school. I will also start by announcing that there is a program tomorrow that folks at the law school want me to mention. We're having a discussion, the war on terror, what process is due to detainees. It's here at 5 p.m., room 225. It really is quite a special day for us here at the Information Economy Project, part of the National Center for Technology and Law, to have today's program, which will feature a speech for maybe about 45 minutes and then a Q&A session for about as long. And the Big Ideas About Information lecture series, and this is what this is, the Big Ideas About Information lecture series, features world-class thinkers addressing key questions of markets, public policy, and technology. Today we're honored and delighted to be treated to an address by an individual who, and I quote now from the Historical Archives of Penn State University, conceived of and created what is arguably the most important gift ever donated by private industry to the cause of democracy in America. Brian Lamb is known to millions of Americans as the architect, CEO, and host of what has now become a remarkable pillar in America's public life, the Cable Satellite Public Affairs Network, or C-SPAN, which he founded in 1979. The network's primary channels, C-SPAN 1 and C-SPAN 2, are now seen in about 100 million U.S. households. The non-commercial presentation of congressional debates and hearings, think tank seminars, political speeches and debates, tape recordings of Supreme Court arguments and presidential phone calls, Book TV, The Road to the White House, and myriad other political, historical, and public policy offerings make C-SPAN a unique and valuable contribution to American life. Yet federal regulation did not always welcome C-SPAN, which in its creation and often since has been on the receiving end of rules designed to protect the public interest in broadcasting. From his exceptional vantage point, Mr. Lamb will explain how the regulation of mass media often triggers the law of unintended consequences. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome Brian Lamb to George Mason University.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming this afternoon. I have to say right out, when Tom called me several months ago and asked me if I would do this, he laid down some rules that I'm not used to. And so this is going to be a compromise. We'll take a little bit of his rules and a little bit of mine. The rule was that he wanted a 45-minute lecture. I'm not a lecturer. He wanted it written for the record. I don't write. So what we've done, I've worked on this. I've made notes, and I'm going to try to make it as conversational as possible. And I might say, even though he's asked for a 45-minute lecture, at any time I make any point that you don't understand or that you want to challenge or you want to question about, just put your hand up. We're going to be here for, I don't know, an hour and a half or something like that, if you last that long. And I want to make sure that the reason I do these things is that if any of you in this room who are looking forward to this kind of a business can learn anything from what our experience has been, it makes it worth the time spent. I want to kind of put an atmosphere to you as to what the world was like when I started in all this. But the first thing I want to say to you up front, the word "I" has never been one of my favorite words. And in order to explain how this works, I want to make sure that you understand that there's a big "we" involved in C-SPAN. I've been involved in it from the beginning. It was an idea that I roughly had back as early as 1969. We went on the air in 1979. But in order to get there, and frankly, in order to stay there, it takes hundreds of people. And along the way, some people have inadvertently tried to derail us. They didn't do it on purpose in most cases, but as you will see when I tell you some of the stories, there have been examples where people involved in this crazy town we live in who didn't like us and didn't want us to succeed on our terms, wanted to succeed on theirs. But it's a complicated process, and what I'll tell you this afternoon isn't the whole story, but it gives you some slice of the different things that happened back in the early days as we went through the number of years. How many people in this room consider themselves a C-SPAN viewer at any time? Is there anybody here that has never watched, knows nothing about it, and will learn everything for the first time today? Who has the guts? That's okay. But I really want, the word "we" has to be in your mind as we go through this process. I'll tell you what my role was in it. As a matter of fact, we started just a couple blocks from here at the Tower Villas Apartments. We had a small studio on the ground floor and had our microwave up on top. And the reason for that was that we were very much involved with the Arlington cable system, and a man named John Evans, who has been still on our board years later, been a tremendous board member, and has guided us through all these years. And as a matter of fact, right now is the chairman of our finance committee and has done a terrific job with our finances as a company. I thought as a way of just putting life into perspective is I'll put these 3 magazines up here on the board. They're all familiar to you. You may not read them, but you've heard of them. Newsweek, U.S. News, and Time. And back when I got involved in all this, that's basically, if you walked into a newsstand, would be similar to how many choices you had overall roughly on television. When I was growing up as a kid, we had a television set in the living room, and it was 13 inches, and it was a crazy, funny shape. And whenever we watched television on Sunday night, we only watched one show together as a family. It's Sullivan's show. We had to watch it. And it's always been my example of what the world was like then. And in those days, television went off at midnight or went off at 1 o'clock in the morning. But this was all the choice you had. 3, I mean, can you imagine if it was this way with magazines? You go into a Borders or Barnes & Noble and some of the superstores, they have 5,000 magazines there. And you now have roughly 350 cable channels. And we were the 6th, just to put it into context. There were only 5 that came before us, and we were the 6th. And you want to know what a fossil I am the oldest living, active CEO in long-term service to this industry in cable television programming that exists. I'm 65 next week, and everybody else that was around when I started is gone. They're not dead, they're gone. They retired or moved on. I mean, in the case of Bob Johnson, who started roughly the same time I did with Black Entertainment Television, he's worth $1 billion. His ex-wife's worth $1 billion. And he has taken his money and invested it in all kinds of things other than television. He's not involved in television anymore at all. He's out of business. The other thing to keep in mind is that many of you in this room I can see are anywhere from 21 to 24 years old, and there are a few that are older. I just made a list of the things that were not around when we started back in 1979. And if you think about the change, it's overwhelming. And none of this is going to be new to any of you in this room, but if you just add it up, the one thing, these are all things that were not available. Multiple theaters. You only had one theater, one screen whenever you would go anywhere. Borders and Barnes & Noble, for all intents and purposes around the country, didn't exist. And they have something like 110,000, 120,000 titles in every one of those bookstores. My little hometown of Lafayette, Indiana, has a Borders and a Barnes & Noble. And I can tell you, growing up, there was nothing like that around. Amazon.com, 24-hour television channels. There was no CNN, Fox, or MSNBC, no USA Today, no national edition of the New York Times. There's only one section of the Wall Street Journal. Now there are 3, and you have the Saturday edition. There were no Walkman, no VCRs, CDs, DVDs, cell phones, PCs. The internet didn't exist for all intents and purposes. There was a system, but it certainly wasn't for the average person. There was, no applause please, no Rush Limbaugh, no iPods, no Bluetooth, no HD TV, no digital cameras, no camcorders, no XM and no Sirius. And the average cable system at that time might have had 20 channels. So that was the atmosphere that I was working in this town. I came here 40 years ago this year. I came here in the United States Navy. I came out of a small town, as I said, in Indiana, Lafayette, Indiana, where Purdue University is located. And when I came here, I had no attachment to anybody. I never belonged to a political party. I worked for both Democrats and Republicans. I got out of that business 30-some years ago and never will do it again. I had a fascinating experience and got to see a lot of things up close. But I was just somebody that came to this town when I was 26 years old, very anxious, just to find out what this place was all about. Now, I want to make this very down-to-earth so you understand how, I mean, Tom Hazen wants me to talk about regulation, I will, but you've got to understand the personal side of this, the human side of this, or none of this will make any sense. Because in the end, every story I tell you about what happened to us, there was an individual involved, no matter what the regulations were. And individuals, believe it or not, still matter. And they can make decisions in this town, one single human being, that will affect millions of people and billions of dollars. I want to just write up on this board here the name of 3 people. And these are people who I knew along the way who made a tremendous difference. And I just wanted, because this is very important. Any of you, no matter what you do, you're going to have these kind of people, and no one ever gives them any credit for anything. And they never pop up unless you write a book, and nobody reads them. This is, when I came here, and I was here fresh and new, and 26 years old, and working in the Pentagon and the Defense Department Public Affairs Office, I had heard that there was something called White House AIDS. Actually, White House social AIDS. And I figured I was single, why not? I had time on my hands. And so I called a friend of mine who I grew up with in Indiana, Barbara Price, who worked for Senator Birch Bayh, the father of Evan Bayh, and said, is there such a thing? She called me back and she said, here's the name of the commander in the Navy. Call him up, go find out what the plan is and whether or not you fit in. I went to see him, he interviewed me, sent me to the White House, and Bess Abel, who was the social secretary, said, yes, we'd like to have you as a part of our operation. That opened up a world that you won't believe. For 2 years, I would go to the White House about 3 times a week. All of them were usually social events of some kind. I continued to keep my job in the Pentagon, but I then started to meet all these incredible people. And I was an absolute nobody, and they treated me usually as a nobody. But I was a fly on the wall. And I would stand next to the President of the United States as the introducer of everybody that came in the receiving line, and just think about that. Standing next to Lyndon Johnson for 2 years, he paid very little attention to me.